What's going on? It's episode 34 of the AskJV show. Today I'm talking about how to dial in your guitar tone, what it means to clip your mix and why you do that, and switching up drum samples on an album.
3, 2, 1.
This is the AskJV show.
Our first question comes from Tyler. You talk about not processing your guitar tones too much and to just make sure you get a good tone from the start. But how do you dial in a tone on an amp? What specifically are you listening for?
Yeah, I'll do my best to describe it. Of course, it's just kind of based on your taste, right? So I'm listening for all the regular things. So if there's the right amount of low end and not too much buildup when they're playing lower notes or chugs. Listening to make sure there's enough high end so that it's going to have enough presence in the mix. I'd say the main thing now that I'm listening for is the mid-range. I want to make sure there's enough mid-range in there to get it to really be solid and cut through the mix, because if you get too scooped of a tone, it just ends up sounding kind of weak in the mix, and you end up trying to make up for that with EQ, and that rarely turns out very well. Usually what I do is I'll throw on a couple records with guitar tones that I like or that are maybe similar to what I'm about to track, and just to get my ears accustomed to it, because of course, you know, a guitar sound coming through an amp, through a mic, through your studio monitors is a lot different than dialing in a tone just standing in front of an amp, right? So you sometimes got to get your ears kind of grounded and used to how a finished guitar sound on a record should sound like. So maybe spend 5-10 minutes just listening, bouncing around different guitar tones on your speakers just to get your head in the right space. Otherwise, it can be really hard to dial in a tone because you feel like you're just guessing, you know? It's like, okay, I guess this sounds good. Hopefully it sounds good on the finished record, right? But if you have kind of a reference point of what a good guitar tone should sound like on a finished record, then it's going to help you dial in the tone. So I wouldn't obsess over it though, you know, don't be comparing back and forth and trying to match a tone, because that's also a never-ending game. Just, you know, get your ears familiar with what it should sound like, get them in the right zone, and then dial in your tone, and make sure you have enough of that mid-range, you know, that 600 to 2K area. Often, you know, with the 5150, which is my favorite amp for heavy stuff or metal, I used to have the mid-range down really low, so it was kind of a scoop sound, but kind of as the years went on, I realized I was always adding in more like 1K on the EQ, so I just started putting at that mid-range gradually more and more until, you know, I had the knob up a lot higher. So yeah, just make sure there's enough mid-range, make sure it's not too bright and not too boomy, and make sure you're referencing to make sure you're in the right ballpark.
This question comes from Justin. Hey Jordan, I've noticed when I load some of my favorite songs into my DAW for referencing that the master is almost always clipping on the modern metal songs. I've heard about clipping the mix bus before and heard it was commonplace on most metal records, but never quite understood when and how it was good to clip your mix. Can you explain this a little better for me?
Yeah, so in that case, what you're seeing in your DAW when you load up a finished mastered record in there and the red light's going on, it's not actually clipping. I mean, it's hitting up to like digital zero or very close to it. So that's when the red light comes on though. So basically, clipping and mastering came about just to get more loudness. You know, it's a byproduct of the loudness wars. And to be honest, it actually, clipping your mix for rock stuff, it actually sounds better in a lot of cases than limiting. But it's to a certain point, of course, with everything. You know, if you clip too much, you start to hear the distortion. It's very fatiguing. But basically, you know, they figured out that if let's say you've got your waveform of your mix, and there's of course going to be transients, right? Little spikes, usually on the snare hits, the drum hits, right? Those are the loudest parts of the mix. Now, if you use a limiter to turn those down to get the whole mix louder, in traditional mastering, you know, with an L2 or something, you're going to affect the strength of the attack of those transients, and that's, you know, it's a common problem with mastering. You know, they get it really loud, but you find that your drums disappear, right? So instead, if you use clipping instead, you actually just pretty much, here's your spike, you just chop off the top of that. So if you actually look at the waveform, it's totally straight across in some points. And basically, if you just clip off the peaks of the drums, you can actually do quite a bit of that without it sounding very obvious. And for rock and metal stuff, it tends to be a lot more transparent than just limiting. So That's why you hear people talking about clipping their mix or clipping the drum bus. You're clipping the drum peaks, and you still get the strength of that attack and like a crack of a snare. It doesn't really affect that. That still remains intact, but you in turn get a lot more loudness out of it. And in some cases, a little bit of clipping can actually make the drum sound more aggressive, because even though, the distortion is so quick, that's why our brains don't really hear it unless the clipping gets so extreme that you start hearing the distortion and the crackling on like the guitars, and it starts affecting like the more steady signals in the mix rather than just the drums. But you can definitely get away with a fair amount of clipping on the drums, still have them sound strong and with lots of attack on the transient, but still get a lot of loudness. So that's what's going on. Mastering engineers use a little bit of that for loudness, either in the box digitally, or I know it's common for mastering engineers with really high-end converters. They'll actually run the mix out through the analog gear and then come back in through converters and actually clip on the converters. So it's just a mastering technique, and that's basically the idea behind it. Hopefully that made sense.
Our last question comes from Erdink. Hey Jordan, when you are mixing the whole album, would you use the same kick and snare samples for every song for consistency? Or would you just choose maybe another sample for other songs?
Yeah, good question. I'd say on the whole, I'm usually using the same samples throughout a whole record, but it really depends what it is. Like some bands have different sounds from song to song, whereas, like a straight up like metalcore band is usually, you're going to have the same sound across the entire record, right? And you hear that a lot these days. Whereas, there's definitely been projects I've done where I have used different samples, but usually it's when I've also used different drums when I actually track it. So if you listen to some Silverstein records I've done, I think especially the second last one, which one's that called? The big buffalo on the front. This Is How the Wind Shifts. Yeah, if you listen to that one, we tracked the drums for that in my studio, and we used a bunch of different snares. Like we used one snare for probably 8 of the songs, and then for the other ones, we were using different snares depending on the vibe of the song. So in that case, I was using different samples to augment that. And it's usually just a matter of vibe. Sometimes for like a slower, more mellower song, we might use like a wooden snare instead of a metal snare, and or maybe we have the snare tuned up really high, so it's really cracky sounding and really bright. Whereas other songs, we want like a thicker, beefier snare sound where we've got it down tuned. In those cases, you might end up using different samples. So it just depends. I would say, if you've got a full record where there's a couple songs that have like vastly different vibes, maybe not even vastly, just a little bit different vibes from the other songs, definitely try out using different samples. I find it keeps your interest as a mixer, helps make things more interesting, and try to really bring out the specific vibe of each song. And then of course also for the listener, just give some variety throughout an album. All right, thanks for watching. Please hit the like button, leave a comment below. Make sure you subscribe to this channel for future episodes and other videos I put out. If you want to get a question on the show for me to answer, go to AskJVPod.com. That's the best way to make sure that we see your question. We try to watch the comments and everything here and make sure we integrate those questions in as well. But if you go to AskJVPod.com, that's the best place to ensure that your question has a chance of getting on the show. So I love answering your questions. Definitely submit it there if you've got something you're confused about. If you're discovering this for the first time via the podcast or on YouTube, then make sure you're on my email list. Go to hardcoremusicstudio.com, click on the link at the top for the free cheat sheet. You're going to get my free mixing cheat sheet and a bunch of free content through my email newsletter. And that's where I send out all the updates about my new stuff and all of my best content. So make sure you're on there. I've got some cool stuff planned for December, lots of kind of free gifts that I'm going to be giving away. So definitely make sure you're on my email list and watch my emails in December. All right, that's it for this week, guys. Thanks. Take care.